Hello, I am Dr. Tanya Smith Brice, Vice President of Education at the Council on Social Work Education. And I'm so pleased to bring to you this critical conversation with my friend, Dr. Colita Fairfax. Dr. Fairfax is a full professor at Norfolk State University. In the School of Social Work. She is a historian. Her work is related to the community, particularly the Black community, marriage interventions and development and social policy. Her work in historiography allows for a longitudinal aspect of helping and healing analysis. Dr. Fairfax has written extensively about Black communities, culture, families, our organizations, and most importantly about the African-American experience in the state of Virginia. Dr. Fairfax was appointed to the city of Hampton, Virginia's 400th Commemorative Commission in 2010, where she contributed to documenting African-American contributions on several historic markers and articulated how the African figure of the tricultural anniversary statue on Settlers Landing Road in Hampton should be depicted. She's also served as co-chairman of the City of Hampton's 2019 Commemorative Commission tasked with planning activities commemorating the arrival of African people in English North America, Port Comfort, in 1619. So, Dr. Fairfax, do you mind if I call you Colita?
Of course I don't mind. You're my friend. Thank you
for
the opportunity. Thank you.
Of course, call me Tanya. So 1619, I've heard a great deal, been so excited about the work around 1619, particularly as it's just posed against 1776. We were taught in school that 1776 is the birth of this nation, but there's a different kind of narrative that has led us to understanding that 1619 might actually make more sense to be identified as the birth of this nation. Can you talk a little bit about 1619 versus 1776?
I live in Hampton, and Hampton is the place where in August of 1619, John Rolfe chronicled in his diary, he witnessed the White Lion, the ship White Lion, landing at Port Comfort, present-day Hampton, where the Fort Monroe National Monument is located. And he witnessed about 20 Africans disembarking that ship. In fact, I like to, for the sake of our discussion, quote a piece of his letter about the latter end of August, a Dutch man of war, the White Lion, of the burden of the 160 tonnage arrived at Port Comfort. The commander's name, Captain Job, his pilot for the West Indies, one Mr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. They met with the treasurer, that's another ship, in the West Indies, and determined to hold consort ship hitherward, but in their passage lost one the other. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals, whereof he was in great need, as he pretended, at the best and easiest rate they could. So here these African people from Angola were traded for food that they needed. And hence we see the beginning with the treasurer, the ship treasurer landing some days afterwards. We see the beginning of African people entering into this forming of English North America, English Virginia, if you will, given the subjugation of Native people. And we see this beginning really of enslavement. 1619 is the same year that the House of Burgesses was created. So we see the beginning, right, of this sickening of human suffering and human trafficking of African people. And it would birth what would become Virginia as a leading colony. And we all know in years to come, so goes Virginia, does the rest of the country. 1619 is vitally important in that those early laws which racialized human treatment which legalized enslavement, began to be birthed in Virginia. And so when we understand African people, we should not only use 1776, the birth of what would become America, but the fact that African people had been here even prior to 1619, because African people came from countries that were seafaring countries, surveilled the world. And so we really should never start our history with enslavement, but with the long history of African people. But with a particular consequence to 1619 is the fact that Virginia and or America would develop as a plantation capitalistic country, a racial capitalistic system, a civilization that the world had really never known before until that moment. And I think it's important and incredibly important for those of us who are in the social sciences to recognize in the lived experiences of people's ancestry and how it's very much connected to patterns of behavior, institutional patterns of treatment. And then this whole notion of how then do we attend to people who come from, right, those patterns where continuously we're having the same experiences because of who we are culturally, racially. And so I believe that's just a little bit of why 1619 is important, with particular emphasis for social workers to really understand that you cannot talk about healing and helping that's outside of history. Everything that we do with regards to transformative change, this thing called social justice, this thing called equity, is about a reckoning with history.
I absolutely love what you just said. And one of the points that sticks out to me is when you talked about it's important that we not talk about the history of African folks and African Americans, starting even with 1619, starting with the beginning of enslavement in this country. Why is that important for social workers in its contemporary context?
So social workers must come to terms with our macro responsibility. And we all know that within the last 35 to 40 years, there's been more emphasis placed on micro interventions, with people entering into licensure situations, private practices, because there's money to be made, or so people believe. And there's a particular level of economic freedom. But social work, though, as a transformative social science, must come to terms with and incorporate in its intellectual bastion the long-lived historical and cultural trajectories that people bring with them. And when that doesn't happen, then you only then see people within a context of vulnerability, helplessness. You only then use contemporary nomenclature, contemporary forms of understanding to apply to people in order to effectuate change. Understanding Black people as the ancient original people on the planet is very important. You then usher in long histories of cultural traditions, of cultural philosophies, of spiritual systems, the importance of rituals, the importance of extended family, which includes community family and church family. You have to evaluate kinship. Kinship, it's not only in the nuclear family, but it's in that broader tapestry of clan and what it means to have those cousins and those play cousins and those godparents and the aunts and uncles, all who are part of who made you who you are. It's coming to terms with and including how then people heal. Healing is not only physical, but there's an entire metaphysical and spiritual aspect to healing. And it's also, I think, important that we attend to brokenness, because the enslavement period was an interruption. It wasn't the beginning, but an interruption to the long history and long narrative of African people. And so when we begin to study African history and philosophy in that way and incorporate it in healing strategies, it's important to do that, because then the healing is different. The development is different. The coming to terms with brokenness and the realities of anti-Blackness that is absolutely a part of the 1619 discussion on into the development of America. And social work has really abdicated. It's walked away, if you will, from that responsibility. Virginia and or America has functioned very much within this anti-Black institutional response. The social policies that developed, particularly if you even go to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, right, which legalized segregation, into the current time, the 1935 Social Security Act, which excluded agricultural workers and domestic workers. Who was doing that work? So here you have the country's first public welfare policy, and Black people who are working hard cannot participate. Latinx people, who primarily agricultural workers, cannot participate. And then even if you continue with the development and the way in which the aid to dependent children program unfolded, and the aid to families with dependent children would unfold in the 50s. And then in the 60s, the very different ways in which those programs changed and became even more hostile to Black people in need. And then the really strange Child Support Enforcement Act of the 1970s, preying and continues to prey uniquely upon impoverished Black men, undermining Black family life in ways that we have yet to really come to terms with. The ways in which policing, the ways in which public welfare has been used to punish people, the child welfare policies and programs that undermine Black life, punish Black life, this notion of taking someone's parental authority away from them because of brokenness, that has become normalized. So we can continue to go on and on, but all of these social policies have been used to regulate and to subjugate Black families. And Dr. Jerome Shealy has written brilliantly about these policies, and so has actually Dorothy Roberts, who is a law professor, have written prolifically. And I'll add to that discussion that it's an anti-Black rhetoric, it's an anti-Black ideology that social work really has yet to come to a reckoning.
Absolutely. And so as I think about Virginia and this, you brilliantly just laid out, particularly social policies that demonstrate this, the lineage of anti-Blackness that stems from that 1619 experience, right? And being able to create a narrative that folks felt warranted the kinds of policies that have been in place. I think about in Virginia in particular, and some of your work that you've done as a gubernatorial appointee to a historical commission around what's happening in Richmond, Monument Row. I'm gonna tell you, I grew up, I went to Richmond, I've gone to Richmond so many times in my life. I've never gone to Monument Row until about 3 years ago, 2 years ago maybe, and saw the gigantic statues that were a testament to white supremacy and the importance of how they were lined up on this street with these beautiful homes, big mansions, churches, and then leading to the State House. I mean, it was it's a straight message, a pathway. These monuments were not put up during the Civil War. They were put up very much later on to remind folks of the anti-Blackness and the lineage of anti-Blackness and the holding up, I mean, the symbolizing literally of white supremacy. Can you talk about the importance of what I've just described and what's was on Monument Row, but the work to dismantle those monuments and the impact that has, or the direction that has, on dismantling white supremacy, and why social workers should be paying attention to that?
With excellent segue. So here you have 1619, and even with 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Black people are physically removed from enslavement, if you will. Enslavement no longer exists, but there was not one policy, not one law that was passed and enforced that ensured that resources, opportunity, this whole notion of really being free in every way, culturally, spiritually, would be respected and provided for. Black people made the way themselves. Those monuments in what we call the Monument District, and I was born and raised in Richmond. I'm a native Richmonder. So the Monument District along Monument Avenue was an area in my home city where you didn't quite feel at home because of the opulence, because of what all of those statues represented, which were erected during the Reconstruction era. And so when Black people were in the Monument District, they were working. They were there to work and then to leave. When my father was a college student at Virginia Union University, HBCU in Richmond, he was a caretaker in the Branch Mansion. That was one of the jobs that my dad had to work his way through college in the late 50s, early 60s. And so again, as a child of Richmond, you see the Monument District and all of the opulence you've described. And then when you go to Church Hill and Northside, where Black people lived in the city, those areas were, and Jackson Ward, historic Jackson Ward, you find the ways in which urban renewal, another policy, undercut those areas. I-95 cut straight through Jackson Ward, all Black community. And you find that really in every major city, that the interstate was just obliterated those sacred spaces in our lives, in our culture, in our history. And so when you juxtapose the Confederate Road, that's what many of my peers and I call it, in the Monument District, and this reckoning now with the killing of George Floyd in 2020, with people, everyday people, connecting state violence, which is what police brutality is, with the historic ideology of anti-Blackness and or Black trauma. It is not surprising that we are at this point. It is not. And it's also not surprising that we're seeing the cultural ideological war backlash. This notion that teachers who are teaching quote unquote critical race theory, which teachers don't teach theories. Teachers teach content that's approved by departments of education. Well, let me just share this with you. What's so fascinating about this backlash is when my commission, the City of Hampton 2019 Commemorative Commission, was working to plan the events around the recognition of the 400th landing of our ancestors. Well, we wrote the Secretary of the Department of Education, indicating that history wasn't taught enough. And in fact, there's intricate Black history that really isn't taught fully, because then you're not teaching culture and you're not teaching context. So, you drop a historical figure's name here and there, but you don't teach context, you don't teach history, you don't teach culture. There's no cultural empathy that teachers are trained in. My commission sponsored a K-12 Teacher Institute for 2 summers, 2018 and 2019, with City of Hampton teachers, where they were trained by scholars in those areas, and also in the area of cultural empathy and how you teach cultural empathy. We were hoping it would be continued in 2020, but the pandemic, of course, interrupted that. So here it's just interesting that people who would not normally have an opinion about curriculum now is expected to weigh in on curriculum about CRT. But then what does this mean for those of us who are considered to be applied social scientists, right? Those of us in this thing called social work. Well, if teachers need to be taught cultural empathy, then I assert that social workers need to be taught cultural empathy as well. I assert that social workers need far more historical training than what we know we receive in BSW and MSW curriculum. I offer that social workers miss the mark when understanding Black experiences that are associated with employment and underemployment and the generational legacy of being the first hired, the first fired, last hired, the intergenerational experiences we have with segregated housing and what that means for when you try to provide the best education for your children. And yet you have Black mothers who are jailed because they're attempting to have their child attend a school in a school district. It's just ridiculous. And that it interrupts one's sensibilities. The impact of anti-Blackness is there. It follows you, it carries you. What we earn, the theories that are not funded by NIH. NIH isn't funding African-centered scholarship. NIH, those governmental entities are not going to fund African-centered paradigms, models, hypotheses. One, because it's not important. And so we just simply don't find those theories to be a part of quote unquote mainstream theories, or whatever mainstream is supposed to mean. That too is saying, oh, well, then they're the important theories, and then there's everybody else.
That's right. That's right.
So social work continues to carry the water for capitalism. So it continues to be a handmaiden for capitalism, and the field needs to be honest about that.
So that's really, really good stuff, because as I hear social workers, social work educators in particular, particularly being concerned about anti-racism, but anti-Black racism, and they say, first of all, why are you just focusing on Black people? And aren't there other isms? Why are we just talking about race? Can you help your social work colleagues to kind of understand the importance of addressing anti-Black and anti-Black racism in order to address all the other isms?
If one studied history, one should study and come to an understanding that America is a race-based civilization. There's just no other way to look at it. The genocide of Native people, the fact that they have been excommunicated on reservations is something that the country has yet to come to terms with. That's an original sin. The role that Black people have been forced to play has been one of vulnerability, to be stereotyped, caricatured in every facet of life. When we talk about every statistics, every indicator of quality of life issues, Black people are impacted through those indicators because of the way in which racism functions in every major social institution, in the economy, in legislative bodies, in public welfare systems, in religion as an ideology that has been used to support social policy, and in public education. Black people have been subjected to not being respected as our cultural selves. You just simply don't find a full articulation about our culture, our rituals, our traditions, the way in which we have cared and protected one another. Social work has yet to understand the importance of race work. Race work is a very significant practice where social reformers, those early social leaders, had to step up and attend to the needs of Black people because, again, during the Reconstruction period, when those great monuments were being erected, Dr. Brice, well, at the same time, those were anti-Black monuments. Those monuments were about ensuring that Black people understood their place and white people understood their place, right? So we those messages that became political, legislative policy statements and laws, and also were used to justify the funding of certain institutions and in certain situations. Well, all of that plays then into this way, the way in which Black people have been treated, have been ostracized, socially excluded, economically marginalized, the way in which Black men in particular have been preyed upon, even through this very time. And even the most liberal of presidents, the most liberal governors have supported such severe policy programs and policy statements because white supremacy is so seamless. It's just a part of American nationalism. And so I don't say this without great pain. I say this recognizing this pain. I say this with a critique of, there are times I don't like America. I can love America and not always like her. And these are the ways in which I think America has benefited from and promulgated this notion of anti-Blackness. And then you really see it play out when certain immigrant groups will come here and they learn quickly. They learn racial power relationships. And they learn then that the Blacker you are, you got to find ways not to appear to side with or show an appreciation for, respect for Black people. And so, immigrants then struggle with the way in which they end up being treated. And, many of us are saying, yeah, but we tried to tell you, or a study in history could have told you the way in which Black people have had to deal with such treatment. And social work as a profession just simply refuses to join the righteous fight. We have this thing called grand challenges of social work. And now one of the grand challenges is about eliminating racism. That is just amazing to me. And it's an example. It's an example. When you read the textbooks that our students must read, the footnoting, right, of certain policies, the footnoting of African-American history, right, social history, the footnoting of what some policies have done. All of the policies have had deleterious impact upon Black people. But the footnoting or the massaging of lofty language without really being honest with our students means that social work continues to carry that water. They're not going to bite the hand. They're not going to do it.
And so I do want to say that there is one of the grand challenges is about eliminating racism. And this is what it reads. It reads, the United States is built on a legacy of racism and white supremacy that has consistently and significantly impacted the daily lives of millions of people. Today, racist policies, bias, and discriminatory practices continue to promote racial inequality in myriad ways. Social work has provided considerable leadership in the civil rights and race equity movements, but has much more work to do, internal to the profession and for society as a whole. We propose to develop a model for eliminating racism by identifying evidence and practice-based interventions that will end racism and ameliorate the negative outcomes of our history of racism. So I want to say that I am thrilled to see that that is in fact there. I think that we need to highlight that. Like that is based on what we've just talked about in this time together, that there needs to be some attention to this, because clearly there needs to be more work in this area that infiltrates the way in which we prepare social workers through social work education through this process, and the way in which we ensure that our faculty understand the importance of dismantling and eliminating these racist structures in which we live and in which we breathe. That is this experiment of the American democracy. We're a republic, but we like to say we're a democracy. Your thoughts on that?
Okay, I can appreciate that. I think for me, it doesn't go far enough.
Yes.
And that could be, and I believe that's my criticism, that it
Yeah.
doesn't go as far as I believe it should go. So,
Yeah.
so
I know that Dr. Martell Teasley, Dean at the School of Social Work at the University of Utah, is now in the Provost's office, is actually writing a book about working on this, and doing an edited book about this work. So I'm looking forward to seeing that, and if that might be instructive to us, or a start to some instruction as to how we do this in social work education.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. For me, when I don't see a firm discussion about the ways in which racism and white nationalism and or white supremacy then dominate institutions, resources, and even ways in which people help seek, ways in which people attempt to have their needs met, right? And they don't, because of racial dynamics. And then this whole notion that community development processes don't get the support and funding because the community development block grants go to cities versus entities that are really doing the heavy lifting in our community. So for me, it just doesn't go far enough, because then there is this reticence to call out white supremacy and white nationalism. It is apparent, and I don't believe that the grand challenges go as far as they should go in that regard.
That's right. Yes, and I absolutely appreciate that. And I think that's kind of the tension that we have as social work educators, that, we have our platitudes, right, in the profession, but are we living them out? And it should be tangible evidence that we can point to and say, yes, this is what we do. And I think that is fascinating. We were talking about how policies that impact, that were written with keeping Black folks in their place impacts other groups. When we think about wages, that whole concept of minimum wage, and particularly the minimum wage that is the different minimum wage that is provided for service workers, right? So our waiters and waitresses, our wait staff earn, their minimum wage is less than, probably a quarter, maybe a third of the minimum wage that's for everyone else. And that's largely because those who served in those roles at the time that this concept of minimum wage was established were Black folks. And so we clearly don't want to pay the same amount as everyone else, but this concept of minimum wage is tied in that. So that's the piece that I think folks need to be very, very clear about when we talk about anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, that we are in essence also talking about all the other isms and all the other groups, because it's rooted foundationally in this anti-Blackness. So we got to address that up front. I want to talk a little bit more about the curricular piece. So there's this concept that we've heard, now that lately folks are all involved in curriculum and non-educators have a say. So we hear this thing called CRT. And I had a wise person say to me very recently that be very careful when you're listening to CRT, because we're assuming they're talking about this theory, critical race theory, and which we know, as you stated, is not something that's taught K through 12, not even K through 16, really. It's a law school concept, right? I learned about critical race theory in my doctoral studies, you know, and that was only because it was related to my research. It wasn't something that was taught as part of the curriculum. But the other CRT, which is the one that folks are really getting at, is culturally relevant teaching. And that's what folks are upset about, is that just as you just described, that there's a curriculum that was developed that was tied with the 1619 commemoration, the 400-year commemoration that took place in Hampton. And that, you know, you had 2 summers that you worked with educators, K through 12 educators, to incorporate this content into their curriculum. But we now see that folks are beginning to do that across the country, or wanting to do that across the country. But even in our social education space, we're saying that it is important that we recognize those very the content that you just brought to us around understanding Black families and understanding Black experience and having culturally relevant content, you know, understanding the plight of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, that also is foundational to all of this. And there are folks who are pushing back saying, but it makes white people feel bad because you're saying that we're bad and we're the cause of this and we're guilty of this, and it makes us just feel bad. How do you respond to your social work colleagues who might not understand the importance of culturally relevant teaching, culturally relevant content, and not understanding that it's the importance of this in social work education? And how do you help your colleagues understand that where they should sit as it relates to white people feeling guilty or feeling bad about the relevance of this in social work education? I know that was a multi-layered question, but.
Right, so, and we have, for those of us who lean in the 24-hour news cycle now, we've seen this discussion in many different forms on many different news shows and different platforms. And what is astounding to me is that the focus continues to be on white parents and white sensibility. The fact that all CRT is suggesting is that there be content taught relevant to the lived experiences of all people, but most definitely Black people, given the racial dynamics that we see play out every day in American society. And the fact then that there is such privilege with the focus of, well, how would white people feel, is endemic of the problem. And so, so yes, people are willing to concede that racism exists and racism is a problem. But then they go from that quick concession to, well, why do I have to feel bad? Well, who said it was about you? Who is saying that? And why are you asserting that? So it is not about you. It is about understanding other levels of existence, others understanding how Black people experience life, how they have experienced life, and where then do we go with the healing and the transformation and the restoration of culture and the reclamation, right, of culture. And so we can't even get to those properties because then the white privilege kicks in, and that would be my response. The white privilege kicks in with, but how am I supposed to feel? Or why do I feel bad? And my question is, you know, why do you believe you have the authority to make this about you? And that is what we see when, you know, this cultural war, this is really a cultural war that we are seeing playing out. It is a cultural war. You know, in the state of Virginia, there's supposed to be this tip line now that the governor, current governor, has offered for parents to call to I'm going to use a term we shouldn't use, snitch on teachers. Now, here are people who are, again, following a curriculum that they're handed, again, and I say to you, a curriculum that I think is insufficient. It is insufficient. And yet, I guess the mere mention of the civil rights movement may send someone who only wants to nestle in their white sensibility to call this tip line. So we need to be clear as social workers what authoritarianism looks like, what fascism looks like. And again, you cannot say to yourself, honestly, that you're about the code of ethics, you're about a just and fair society, and not see the damage that is played out here. And when you look at the curriculum in social work, I mean, we're definitely not on a lofty path. It mirrors a Eurocentric curriculum. So it mirrors white culture, white history, white experiences, and then there's everybody else. And you know, the ascension of this term BIPOC, which irritates me to no end. So here we have a term that is being used that doesn't come from the community. This is not a term that is birthed in movement. This is an academic term that's supposed to be empowering. How is that empowering? What you're doing is you're putting everybody who is not white in a bowl, and that's dangerous. And it continues a pattern of a power dynamic in social work where they're white people and then they're the rest of y'all. And it continues a power dynamic of theory, of application, of methodology. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. And it's so seamless when, and I'll say this, when there are African-American scholars who have bought into the term and use it in a way in which they believe is emancipatory, and I reject that.
That is absolutely wonderful.
No, I just one step further. The other piece about the culture war is that in social work, we need to look beyond at other ways in which we usher in restoration and healing. The work that I do with the Department of Historic Resources as a board member of the State Board of Historic Resources in Virginia, where we vote upon state highway markers. And there, under Governor Northam, there was a push to ensure that there would be more markers that would be inclusive and would educate people to landscapes in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where Black people, Native people, and now we have some markers that are representing some Asian American historical figures. But what I want to say to you, Doc, is the markers have become forms of community healing, of people being able to finally see certain historical narratives, finally come to the forefront, finally come from out of obscurity. We see neighborhoods coming back from the brink of oblivion because of these markers. And it is another form of community development, because then people are now remembering. So we see the value of public memory, and they're now coalescing around these landscapes, and they're creating foundations and community cooperatives, and churches are forming with other agencies and institutions. It's a beautiful thing. And so I think social workers need to come out of you know, the social service industry, the capitalistic enterprise and look at other forms to engage in upgrading, beautifying communities, other ways to build assets in forms of development. And I think we could do much more work if we did those things.
And so I think these kinds of conversations, this kind of work, this kind of really struggling with what is and what should be, will help us move further towards where we should be. But it requires all of us to do the work, regardless, Black or white or indigenous or whatever. It requires all of us to do this work to dismantle racist structures, to eliminate anti-Black racism, and to be to that level of specificity. And when we look at every part of what we do, we should be looking at ways in which we can dismantle, disrupt, eliminate. I am so appreciative to you, Dr. Colita Fairfax, for this time that we've had to share a little bit of the conversations that we have when it's just us one-on-one talking, when without the cameras. And so I'm very grateful to you for sharing your wisdom and for representing the best of social work education as this work is being done throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia, but also throughout this nation. Do you have any parting words for us?
I hope that this conversation will move the needle in social work education and or in the provider community. Because we need to see some different things now. And now when you and I are 90 years old. But I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I thank you so much. Thank you. Just thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.